Over the last many years, a huge amount of money is being spent by the government on procuring digital hardware and ICT. Yet, there is widening and persistent gap in their usage and in teaching and learning outcomes. A huge amount of public money is being spent, but where is the accountability? अगर हमारे देश को 2047 तक एक डेवलप्ड नेशन बनना है, we will have to deep dive into these challenges, identify the root cause of what is stopping our government school teachers and students from using digital resources that are being given to them. और इस सीरीज़ में हमारी कोशिश यही होगी कि हम ऐसे कई चीज़ों के बारे में बात करें और ऐसे इश्यूज़ को अनकवर करें और ये समझें कि आखिर कैसे हम सही तरीके से यूसेज को, लर्निंग को इंस्टीट्यूशनलाइज कर सकते हैं. इनफैक्ट when we were thinking of choosing a topic for this podcast series, we looked at many issues and we realized that this obsession that the government has with procuring hardware is perhaps the root cause of why actual learning is not happening. कहते हैं ना, you get what you procure. And as a result of that, there are lakhs of government schools which have IFPs and TVs hung on the wall, desktop जो शायद धूल खा रहे हैं और laptops या tablet जो बच्चों को दिए तो जा रहे हैं लेकिन उससे learning नहीं आ पा रही है. In the first podcast of this series, we will try and talk about one important issue of usage tracking, monitoring, and the reporting dashboard. And to talk about this, to discuss this, I have with me Shri Anil Swarup ji, who is the former Secretary of Education, Government of India, also former Secretary in the Ministry of Code. Sir, before I bring you to this issue that I just talked about, like in the last discussion that I had with you, I would just simply go back at the time when you were at the helm of the government of the Ministry of Education, the Government of India. A revised ICT policy was introduced. I want to understand from you, sir, that what was the vision behind that you carried at that point?
See, the fundamental aspect was that technology was coming in big time. The issue was how do we leverage this evolution of technology to improve learning outcomes. This was the bottom line. What needs to be done to enable the child to enjoy learning and then learn? Because one of the biggest problems with school education in India was, and perhaps still is, that the learning outcomes are not improving. So the question was whether technology could be a huge enabler. To my mind, it can be a huge enabler. As I mentioned during my last interaction with you also, that I myself discovered that learning itself could be such a pleasurable experience if it is done through use of technology. And that's where computers, the smart TVs, all these can be very useful. The question is whether they are being put to use, as you rightly put in your introduction. That yes, the objective is clear, that this is what needs to be done. Yes, the process has got underway, but there's something gone amiss somewhere, that the desired outcome that should result as a consequence of whatever indulgence that has happened with so much money that has been spent, is it improving learning outcomes? Is it making education a more pleasurable experience? Is what was envisaged happening? I'm not very sure whether it is even being measured at this point in time.
So, very interestingly, in your vision statement, you mentioned learning outcomes multiple times, right? Very aptly, very rightly put, and I also personally believe in that. So, the follow-on question to you is that if the vision started from improving the learning outcomes, where do you think this has gone wrong?
I think this has to do with our general understanding of how technology has to be used in variety of purposes. So we perhaps, and I'm not very sure whether that is right, but that's my understanding, that we got it the wrong way. We first identify the hardware because that's the easiest and probably the most lucrative way of going about it. So hardware was identified, hardware was procured. And then we thought in terms of software. And then we thought in terms of how to use that software. It should have been the other way around. It should have been clearly defined as to what was required to be done, what is the software required for that, and then identify hardware to get it. But as I saw personally also on some occasions, that hardware is sitting there and nothing is happening to that hardware. And if at all it is happening, it is not being used to an optimum level. So that's the problem with regard to procurement. And then in some cases, lack of understanding on the potential that this has, as also lack of understanding of the extent to which and the manner in which it ought to be used. So whereas, as I can use the term, it was sexy to get all the hardware sitting there, it looked very attractive. But whether it was being put to the use for which it was brought, there's a huge question mark.
So where is the gap then? Is it the gap in terms of intent of the officials who are involved in the procurement? Is it lack of understanding? Where is the gap?
It is a combination of all. I mean, yes, I think some people have a different objective of IT in the sense of getting hardware because there is money there. In some cases, there is indifference. There is a decision taken, it has to be done, so it is being done. I'm not very sure whether schools are even being sensitized about the potential of what they are getting. Because yes, equipment is coming, so any equipment and associated equipment, whether tables, chairs, and what have you, it looks very attractive. But whether the school themselves internalized the potential of what was being procured there, and that of course was related to appropriately sensitizing and training those that, sensitizing in the sense of the use of it and training in the sense of how to use it, whether this was done appropriately. Because hardware in itself is nothing. The question is how it is to be used, who's going to use it, and the people who are going to use it, whether they are fully conversant with the potential of what is being put there and they have been equipped with the use of those instruments. So I think the training and information dissemination is as important as procurement of goods. So I don't think it would have happened because total indifference. In some cases it is indifference. In some cases, not being fully aware of the potential of those equipments, because such decisions get taken at a different level, and then they get, so to say, imposed on people below, rather than they're not so much demand driven as they're supply driven. So you have it, someone decides, some sitting somewhere, that this needs to be done. It gets imposed on those people, and since it has to be imposed, it comes. As a consequence of which, some schools, some institutions who become aware of its utility, of its potential, start using it. But a large number of them don't, and that money goes down the drain.
In fact, sir, most of the RFPs that come out have very detailed specifications of the hardware to be procured, as you rightly pointed out. But there is hardly any details about what kind of tracking should happen, what kind of data monitoring should happen, what kind of reporting dashboards should be set up so that regular monitoring can be enabled.
So before you talk in terms of monitoring, we must know what is to be monitored. So in a large number of RFPs, you may not even find the outcomes. You have to define the outcomes in order to monitor. Now, if you've not clearly defined what are you attempting to achieve that, so there are intermediate targets that hardware will be supplied, whether it has been supplied, whether it is of the desired quality. That, of course, can be intermediate target. That's not the objective. Objective could be that if a child is at level A, whether he goes to level B. Okay, you have to define that. And then you monitor whether he has actually gone. And for doing that, you have to also have the understanding as to what is the process through which you go from A to B. So whether those processes can also be monitored. So for example, I'm just taking a random example, that a child has to take so many sessions, number of sessions. It's as simple as that. Whether the child has attended so many sessions. Like we used to have in our schools attendance, no? If you don't have 75% attendance, you can't give an exam, you're disqualified or something like that. I mean, that's very simplistic. But here, in order to go from level A of learning to level B, it would be assumed that you would take so many sessions. Now, I wonder whether there is any monitoring of whether the child has actually attended so many sessions. And for that, there are other things also. The guides. Because child himself will not go and start using the computer. There has to be some trainer sitting there. Whether the trainer himself has been. So there are intermediate targets in the sense of whether the trainer has been trained. So that's target number one. When he comes here, how many children has he taught? How many sessions has he taken? Then how many sessions has the child done? Now this requires a bit of indulgence in the sense of determining that from reaching from level A to level B, so many sessions of this thing is required. A particular program is required. So he has to practice that. It has to be very granular. Then only you can talk in terms of monitoring, because if you don't have the granularity in the parameters on which you will monitor, so determining the parameters, I'm not sure whether those parameters are determined or they are only mentioned in general terms that it will improve the learning outcomes. So what do you mean by learning outcomes? There's defined parameters. And then you see whether as per those parameters, the child has actually achieved that. But this is the ultimate thing. But to arrive at that, there are intermediate targets that have to be fixed. There are intermediate activities that have to be undertaken. For them also, the clear-cut guidelines should be there. This is what sought to be achieved. That clarity, I would assume, is missing.
It is missing, sir. And मैं जितने भी पुराने RFPs या इस साल भी जो RFPs आए हैं, हमने सारे स्टडी किए हैं. Most of the RFPs have just single line item about reporting dashboard, and now they have started mentioning that the reports that your software generates should be synced with the state MIS.
But the problem here is, what is state MIS? What is the state also monitoring?
It is nowhere defined.
So we have to have that clarity first. As I keep saying, Before you get down to monitoring, you have to understand what is to be monitored. And that has to be clearly defined and detailed. And that has nothing to do with the hardware per se. Hardware only enables that. But whether a particular teacher or a trainer has undergone a particular training or not is an intrinsic part of deliverables that you're going to achieve ultimately. But that doesn't appear anywhere. And secondly, it's not merely anybody getting trained anywhere. As we were informally discussing, there's an English teacher who comes there, gets trained in something which is not equipped, and he doesn't get trained. So who's going to be trained? So as I keep saying, the granularity has to be there. Who has to be trained? How many sessions? Where is to be trained? Who will train the trainer? All this has to work out, and this needs to be monitored. Because if this gets monitored, then the ultimate outcome can also be monitored. If you don't monitor all that and only measure, then every time you'll come that the child has not improved, without realizing that the process that he has to undergo before he graduates from level A to level B, that process is not there, and there's no monitoring of that. So it's a very serious matter, because crores of rupees are being spent on hardware, and not many are actually evaluating whether the hardware is serving the purpose for which it was procured.
Sir, in fact, यहाँ पर ही एक important मेरा question ये है that the process that you mentioned about, firstly identifying the learning outcomes and then building a process through which that can be, set up on the ground. Is it too complicated कि हमारे state government officials इसको कर ही नहीं सकते हैं, capability नहीं है हम लोग?
It's in fact, it's not complicated at all. It requires indulgence. वो indulgence ये मिल रहा है कि priority क्या है? I mean, I don't know about their priorities, but I'm assuming that they're busy elsewhere.
The government is doing asset survey, the government is doing national NASs हो रहे हैं, all the data points are coming in front of us, और सारे data point यही बता रहे हैं that learning outcomes have barely improved over the past couple of years. तो जब ये इतना बड़ा issue है, right, why are we not going down and addressing this?
This takes me to a larger issue. ये आपको बड़ा issue लग रहा है, मुझे भी बड़ा issue लग रहा है कि, लेकिन ये बात का issue है, बात करने की बात है. आज की हमारी प्रायोरिटी, मैं अक्सर लोग मुझसे पूछते हैं कि जब एजुकेशन के लिए इतने कंसर्न हैं, आप हैं, मैं हूँ, और सब लोग कंसर्न हैं, तो होता क्यों नहीं एजुकेशन? दिस विल एक्सप्लेन द पॉइंट दैट यू आर आस्किंग ऑल्सो. सी, फॉर अ पॉलिटिशियन टुडे, what is more important, tomorrow or 5 years down the line? That's the answer to this question. The priorities, everyone talks about education, but no one indulges in it to the extent that it should. And it's a tragedy. Everyone will talk big about education, but this requires a lot of granularity, going into the details of it. The tragedy is the details don't give you publicity. Now, if my concern is to be visible, then details don't give you that visibility. So the concern is for a conference, a big occasion, creating those occasions where it could be, part of social media or general media. So the priorities are awry. In case of education, you can't have publicity as the objective. You can have it elsewhere, but not in education. Education has to be solid, hard groundwork. And that is what is required here. It's not difficult. To give you an example, so if I have to determine what are the parameters on the basis of which I'll assess a particular process has been followed or not, who would be interested outside the person who is doing it? Media will not be interested, people reading will not be interested, so why should it should be highlighted at all? What will get highlighted is कि ये पैरामीटर, ये क्या कहते हैं, लर्निंग आउटकम्स इंप्रूव हुए थे, और किसी की रिपोर्ट आ जाएगी, वो लोग डिस्कस कर लेंगे. अरे भाई, जो रिपोर्ट लाता है वो ये क्यों नहीं करता? ये भाई लगातार हर वर्ष, हर दूसरे वर्ष रिपोर्ट्स आ रही हैं, है ना, तो एक्शन क्यों नहीं हो रहा? क्यों? क्योंकि उसका ऑब्जेक्टिव, आप जो एक्शन करेंगे, इट विल नॉट हिट द हेडलाइंस. सो आई थिंक वी गॉट our priorities wrong. And having been in education for a while, I used to raise it then also, that education may not give you that amount of publicity. But I think if you do not indulge in it at this point in time, we are in serious trouble in the days to come. Because it's not merely learning outcomes, it's your whole approach to things. If you don't address substantive issues, then in the long run there is trouble. The good news, however, is that there's increasing awareness about it, that poor learning outcomes is an issue. And if the country thinks in terms of going somewhere at 2047, there is no way that it can go unless majority of its population is actually learning, which it isn't at this point in time. And the second thing that to my mind is dawning is that technology can be a great enabler. Now the question is, how do we present it before the decision makers and practitioners in the field and that's a challenge, that if you develop these components, these parameters, and set up a monitoring system, your own objectives will be fulfilled. And maybe then you can get a lot of positive publicity, in the sense that if learning outcomes actually improve, you can go to town and say that we followed this particular method. But this journey does not give you the publicity. The outcome can give you.
And because it requires a bit of an effort, तो शायद पॉजिटिव पब्लिसिटी आए ना आए, लेकिन लोग नेगेटिव पब्लिसिटी से शायद डर रहे हैं. बिकॉज इफ proper tracking starts happening, monitoring starts happening, data becomes public, then non-improvement in learning outcomes or a dip in learning outcome would be a very negative for the ministry and the government.
The problem with problems is that we refuse to accept that problem as a problem. By accepting it as a problem, you get negative publicity. Little realizing that until you accept existence of an issue or a problem, how in the hell are you going to improve upon it? You can only improve if you first accept. And that again is a serious problem these days. It's like putting on makeup, you're not looking the fundamental issue, but you're somehow painting your face. So that fundamental issue becomes worse over a period of time. So that sensitization has to happen. Has to start with, informed people, aware people should go around and talk to them that in the long run, you are going to benefit. You are also going to get publicity. But right now, indulgence would be, so to say, underground. I mean, it will not be visible. Because as I said earlier, the task of determining those process-related parameters is the first step towards going into monitoring. You talked about monitoring. Monitoring will happen only we have clarity on what we are going to measure. So, for example, there is a trainer who's supposed to guide children into use of computers. Now, the trainer himself will have to be trained. Now, if he is not trained and he is not a trained trainer, then how will he help the child to use the hardware that is sitting on the table? I'm just taking a very general example just to illustrate that there are many dimensions to this process. And one such dimension is training of trainers. Now, then you have to step one step before that. Who's going to be the trainer? Whether a person who's teaching English literature would be better equipped as compared to a person who's teaching mathematics. I'm not saying who should be, but a clarity has to be there that these guys with this background will be the trainers, and these guys will be the trainers of trainers. Now, again, I keep going step back because there are multiple ways in which you have to look at the various sets of activities that have to be undertaken before a child becomes better than what he or she is. So, we have to identify all these aspects that influence learning outcomes, how technology helps him or her improve her learning outcomes, and then identify at each level in various dimensions what is the action that is required of each individual or the process, and then go in for monitoring of that. So, for example, we'll say, okay, whether you selected the right person to be the trainer. We define the parameters that he should be qualified, this. He should have studied maths, so on and so forth. He becomes the trainer. That's first tick. Then, what sort of a training which should be given to him? That has to be identified. Who will train the trainer? Then whether the number of sessions that the trainer had to take, whether he is taken or not. So one by one, we'll have to define all these. Once you've defined that, then technology takes over. Then it's not very difficult. The advantage of technology is that once you define the parameters, then it becomes very easy. Then only data entry will happen. Okay, he attended this. Okay, yes or no, whether he had this qualification, yes or no. And then it gets aggregated. You can analyze and see whether moving ahead. Now, these will be all process evaluation. This will all be process. The outcome evaluation will come later. My hunch is that if processes are correct and they are evaluated correctly, learning outcomes will improve. Now, what is the easiest thing is, which most of the studies do, these are people who get paid and do studies, is determine learning outcome. अरे भाई मुझे पता है यार, मुझे दोबारा बता रहे हो कि नहीं है. That used to be my approach, that you can't improve the outcomes unless you improve the processes. Whether it was school or little time that I had in education, the focus was on process. I mean, I learned it the hard way. I mean, when I was school secretary, everyone talked about how will this. I said, we are going to redefine the process. We are going to digitize the process. So initially people didn't understand, ये तुम क्या कर रहे हो? मिलेगा क्या ये बताओ? मैंने कहा मिलेगा तब जब आप process. The tragedy is that the process doesn't give you publicity. The process doesn't get to be known. But the outcome is determined. भाई कर्मण्येवाधिकारस्ते मा फलेषु कदाचन. भाई कर्म तो process है ना. आप वो नहीं करेंगे ठीक तो रिजल्ट कैसे अच्छा आ जाएगा? दैट इज द प्रॉब्लम विद एजुकेशन. हम भी कीप जंपिंग. तो ये जितना इवैल्यूएशन होता है ना, लर्निंग आउटकम, लर्निंग, अरे भाई करे क्या? ये कोई नहीं बात करेगा, ये नहीं है, बिकॉज अगेन दैट गिव्स पब्लिसिटी कि लर्निंग आउटकम नहीं इंप्रूव हुए, दैट्स अ पब्लिसिटी.
इनफैक्ट लॉट ऑफ रिसर्च हैज हैपेंड रिसेंटली ऑन लर्निंग आउटकम्स. वो यही कहते हैं कि लर्निंग आउटकम तब इंप्रूव होता है जब बच्चा प्रैक्टिस ज़्यादा करेगा, विच इज़ काइंड ऑफ ऑब्वियस. मतलब बच्चा, हमें भी पता है कि जब बच्चा प्रैक्टिस करेगा तो लर्निंग आउटकम इंप्रूव होंगे. लेकिन इट इज़ नॉट टॉकिंग अबाउट द प्रोसेसेस कि हाउ डू यू सेट अप दोज काइंड ऑफ मॉनिटरिंग प्रोसेसेस, ट्रेनिंग प्रोसेसेस. एक लैब के अंदर अगर बच्चा आ रहा है तो क्या होना चाहिए सो दैट अ स्टूडेंट इज एबल टू यूज द टेक्नोलॉजी.
भाई आप हर चीज
टॉकिंग अबाउट दैट.
यू कैन एक्चुअली ड्रॉ आउट क्लियर कट प्रोटोकॉल्स. उसके बाद मॉनिटर करेंगे प्रोटोकॉल फॉलो नहीं हुआ, तो पहला काम तो प्रोटोकॉल्स डिफाइन करना है ना, कि बच्चा कितनी देर रहेगा, क्या करेगा, फिर आप मॉनिटरिंग. आई डोंट थिंक मॉनिटरिंग विल बी अ प्रॉब्लम.
ऑल EdTech solution providers provide monitoring मतलब वो तो हमारे भी ऐप का, हर ऐप का एक पार्टी है मॉनिटरिंग.
तो वो तो हो जाएगा, लेकिन क्या करना है वो प्रैक्टिशनर्स के साथ बैठकर अंडरस्टैंड करके तब बनाना जरूरी है. मैं नहीं समझता बनाया किसी ने, मतलब नो वन इज, आई मीन एज यू से मॉनिटरिंग ऑफ फाइनल आउटकम्स तो मिल जाता है, कितना होगा कोई ना कोई कर ही देता है. बट आई टेल यू गोइंग टू द प्रोसेसेस पार्ट, एंड आई कीप using this term processes. I am a great believer that if you set the processes right, chances are your outcomes will improve.
I think that is in fact one of the most insightful thing that I would take away from this podcast. हमने start किया था to talk about learning outcome data, monitoring data, but I think we have gone a bit deeper and we're talking about कि उसके पीछे के processes, वहाँ पे जो monitoring होनी है पहले आप उसको set कीजिए, and then the eventually जो learning outcome और data आना है, usage data, वो तो technology दे ही रहा है.
Is the process human, whether human resource related है, human related या technology related है, या practice related है, या training related है.
In fact, I would want to go a bit more on learning outcome data, what to monitor and what not to monitor. But before that, I want to break one more myth. वो ये है कि जब हार्डवेयर प्रोक्योरमेंट होता है तो साथ में MDM का प्रोक्योरमेंट भी होता है आजकल. तो MDM stands for मोबाइल डिवाइस मैनेजमेंट, राइट. एंड अ लॉट ऑफ स्टेट्स शो द डेटा विच कम्स फ्रॉम MDM एज, हाँ देखिए हम मॉनिटरिंग कर रहे हैं, डेटा आ रहा है. बट MDM, वी हैव टू अंडरस्टैंड, द ऑडियंस शुड ऑल्सो अंडरस्टैंड, MDM इज ओनली गिविंग यू डेटा अबाउट कि हार्डवेयर कितना टाइम चला, कब बंद हुआ, कब ऑन हुआ, ख़राब तो नहीं है. बेसिक हार्डवेयर, नो, इट्स नॉट लर्निंग डेटा एट ऑल.
पर मतलब उसका पर्पस क्या है? अगर उसके बैकग्राउंड में जो करना है वो किया ही नहीं, तो कंप्यूटर चला और इस्तेमाल हुआ किस लिए हुआ?
हाँ, ये नहीं आ रहा है अभी.
बट दैट इज एन इम्पॉर्टेंट इनपुट, बिकॉज विदाउट दैट ऑल्सो नथिंग विल हैपन. But even before that, if the processes are not streamlined or quantified or monitored, then what are you trying to ultimately see कि इतनी देर चला कंप्यूटर?
Right, so my point was, this is good to have data, but ये इसको लर्निंग डेटा से कंफ्यूज नहीं करना है. वी हैव टू वेरी क्लियरली डिफरेंशिएट कि वो हार्डवेयर का डेटा आ रहा है एंड लर्निंग डेटा हैज़ टू कम इन सेपरेटली. सो वी हैव टॉक्ड अबाउट कि प्रोसेस कैसे इस्टेब्लिश करना चाहिए. अभी लर्निंग आउटकम और यूसेज की थोड़ा बात करते हैं. तो फ्रॉम योर एक्सपीरियंस आई वांट टू अंडरस्टैंड, बिकॉज यू वर अ पार्ट ऑफ द मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ एजुकेशन, आप सेक्रेटरी रहे. तो आपको अगर किसी स्टेट लेवल पे मान लीजिए आप प्रोजेक्ट कर रहे हैं, किस तरह का डेटा यू वुड प्रेफर टू सी ऑन योर डैशबोर्ड विच यू थिंक विल हेल्प यू टू अंडरस्टैंड द ओवरऑल हेल्थ ऑफ the digital learning equipment which have been provided in this?
No, if you are talking in terms of outcomes, then it's a different data. But if you're talking in terms of processes, it is different data. So let's start with process. So process, mein jaise I had mentioned earlier, who all have to be trained and whether their selection has been done, whether they have actually been trained, whether they have been tested. This was one level of trainers data. Then there will be children data, which would again not be very difficult. How many sessions in what area they have taken, what purpose they have taken, how many sessions they have taken, have they been tested in certain parameters, whether tests have happened, what are the results of that. That will give me both the process as well as the outcomes, because child का आज level A है, 6 महीने बाद उसको टेस्ट करेंगे तो वो किस लेवल पे पहुंच रहा है. So all this will come. That is the data that I like to have at my end. And I would have an aggregate data, but it gets disaggregated and you go down the level. But aggregate level पर I'll say, okay, I required 100 trainers of this criteria. So someone has to certify first that the criteria was fulfilled. They have come. What sort of a training have they got? Then once I know that they have been trained, then I will try and see how one trainer is doing better than the other. There, that can have the, we can compare that so many children have gone from level A to B by this trainer, so many children have gone from this level to this level by this trainer. So we can compare and see which of the trainers are able to get more children rise up the level of learning outcome. So that becomes the evaluation of the trainer. Then of course the child. There are 100 children. How many sessions they have held? That will be process part. Then in the learning outcome you will see how many of these children have improved actually. from level A to level B. So it's not very complex. It's not very complex at all. But the question is, it needs to be done. It requires much more intensive indulgence as compared to the indulgence which comes automatically, or results which come automatically through MDM. That itni der chala computer, itne log baithe computer, wo theek hai. Without that, nothing will happen. That is there. But that's not the outcome. That is also a process-related determinant. But outcome will be whether the child is able to calculate better, to discriminate, read better. Yeah.
Sir, इस पूरे procurement में there are two sides of the coin. The one side is the government, of which we just talked a lot about. The other side is the system integrators, hardware brands, bidders, right? Who are perhaps, and we do respect to them, are operating purely from the point of view कि मेरा hardware लगना है, right? उस ecosystem में, do you think there is a hope that these guys would be able to understand that learning is important, and therefore, because they are the ones who are front-ending the people, doing the licensing with the government officials, will they ever be understood?
No, I don't think it is wrong to expect of them to become interested in improving learning outcomes. Because there are so many other factors that actually determine whether the child improves his learning or not, in which he has absolutely no role to play. He should be assessed based on the quality of hardware he provides, the quality of software he provides, the quality, if at all, if they're asked to provide the evaluation systems. They can only be evaluated on the basis of systems, hardware, based on certain parameters.
No, let them be evaluated based on that. For other sort of evaluation, EdTech players like us exist. My question was that because they are the ones who have access to government officials, they are the ones who are doing licensing, right? So when they help the government or advise the government to stitch together a project, do you think they are the ones who can raise a voice within the government कि आप learning के बारे में सोचिए?
Normatively, they should, but why would they? Why would they? Let us assume they are doing business. उन्हें अपना माल बेचना है, वो माल बेच रहे हैं. Have to expect them to see that, to guide the... for selling the product, they will say it will help improve learning outcomes. Obviously, they can't sell a product without telling that it would improve. That's their selling point. But to hold them responsible, because whether the learning outcomes improve or not, one of the functions is the hardware and the software, but there are many other functions. So how do you, ask them to do that? They will say, okay, the equipment that I'm provided is foolproof, good, maintenance free, this, that, and everything. Okay. So they can be held responsible for that. Software, it works very well. If the child is interested, if the guy is trained, 100% result is there. But whether the child is interested or not, whether the trainer has trained or not, whether electricity comes or not, it's not their problem. So they can be held responsible only for what they can. So they can be held, and that is for the job of the person who's procuring it. That's his job to see whether what is being procured serves the ultimate objective of what is being done. So long as that is done, his job gets over.
My question was only from the point of view understanding what would it take to change this system. हमने fear की बात करी, हमने indifference की बात करी,
it is the guys who are procuring it, they have to change.
How is the next
to
question?
Demonstrate to them that it is useful to them if they follow a particular process. For example, if someone can tell them, sir, these are the aspects that you can easily monitor. It's not very difficult. But probably you never thought about it. Because if they get monitored, then the learning outcomes will improve. No, I'm quite sure that each one officer there is certainly interested in improvement of learning outcomes. No one will say I'm not. But probably they have not indulged sufficiently to understand how that can happen. Once that gets demonstrated, that by following a particular process, the chances of learning outcomes improving. That's how improvements happen in society. You have a demonstration effect by somebody who understands the processes and improves upon it. And then others start learning from it. So I'm not very sure. I've not been in touch with the people of late. But I don't know whether there are sufficient places where there has been a demonstration that by a particular use or manner of use of a hardware and software, learning outcomes have already improved. I think it's high time we try to find such models existing in the country where certain civil servants or others who have followed a particular process and have resulted in improvement. Right now we are talking in macro level, general terms, that learning outcomes have not improved. But I'm sure there will be pockets where learning outcomes have actually improved. I remember when I was Secretary of School Education, we used to find such models and then present them before others. That look here, they are in a similar set of circumstances. They have shown this improvement in this field. Would you like to take a look at it? And they did. And that's how replication and scaling happens. So what really needs to be done is scout around for such areas, such segments where learning outcomes has improved, and then study how did they improve. What was the manner in which that hardware and software was used? What sort of a training was done? Make out a case and then present this case before others, because seeing is believing. Otherwise, you'll keep telling people will not believe, अरे यार इससे क्या फर्क पड़ेगा. Quite a few of us are very cynical in nature, कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ना. But if you present a model where learning outcomes have actually improved, and I don't know whether this research has been done, we have tried to find out models where use of technology has actually improved learning outcomes or otherwise other outcomes. Once that gets, I was always of the view that Niti Aayog should be doing this. Nobody else. Niti Aayog is well positioned to identify, instead of indulging in their own aspirational and perspirational districts, they should find good models that are working in the country, present it before others, because they have the wherewithal and the credentials to hold conferences, and that's what the conference should be, where a person could come and say, okay, I brought this hardware, I brought this software, which all of you brought. But this is what I did. And this is what has been the outcome. That's the best way. Then also, Niti Aayog can also associate with people who have been in the field working and then get them to make presentations. I mean, Niti Aayog may not do it, but as I keep saying, it's all a public-private partnership. I mean, even a hardware supplier can actually come up and say, sir, we supplied at 10 places. This place it has worked.
Exactly. That was my point
So
that I was
that
trying
is,
to make.
and then you recognize that hardware supplier. I mean, we have to have this system of recognizing people who are bringing forth something good that has happened. You recognize that supplier. Supplier gets greater credentials. I mean, he gets to be known that he's not merely interested in supply of hardware. He's also interested in improving learning outcomes, which has actually happened. And they then can present a model and say, this is what we did, this is what the government did, and this model can be replicated elsewhere. I don't think we are sufficiently discussing success models also. Because it's easy to talk in macro terms and say, okay, learning outcomes have improved marginally. Marginally is an average. There will be some where outcomes would have gone down. In some, it would have gone substantially up. Now, let's try and understand, how did that happen? How did learning outcomes go up to a level that we had not visualized? What exactly was done? And then identify and see if we could replicate.
The good thing is there have been some recent studies that have been done, especially around adaptive learning, which have shown improvement in learning outcome. But I think it would be interesting to go deeper into those studies and understand what worked. So far, to my limited understanding, what I have read and understood is that because those students were made to practice on the applications more, therefore it improved. But I think we need to go deeper to understand.
We have to model it. What is modeling? You go deep into it and see what is the construct. How did it happen?
Yeah.
And then see how it could be customized to other locations.
And how it can happen in a natural way for teachers to adapt it in a regular school setting and not influence it through a lot of external parameters.
That's some of the problem with pilots. I mean, I jokingly say that in India, pilots don't fly literally and otherwise. For the simple reason, when you have a pilot project, almost everyone is indulging in it. So somehow works. But that indulgence is not forthcoming elsewhere. So it doesn't get replicated to scale. So as you rightly said, in natural set of circumstances, if it has evolved, when we say natural, it means that the indulgence that was there to make that thing happen, similar type of indulgence can happen elsewhere. So it was nothing unique. It was only the different process that was adopted. The same process adopted elsewhere would work. So that's what we got to do.
Before I end, sir, I want to share about our own experience of implementing digital learning in a particular state. And in that particular state, in a lot of government schools, both tablet-based digital library and smart classroom have been implemented. And while we insisted on doing school-wise trainings, but then eventually district-level trainings were organized. And from some school, a science teacher came. From some other school, a mathematics teacher came. Someone said an English teacher. And while district-level trainings happened, but eventually it is very hard to expect that that particular teacher will now go back to the school and train all the other teachers as well as the students. So such is the state of the affairs. And in those same set of schools, recently we had to organize a trip for some other government official. And when our team called those schools, कि क्या हम आपके स्कूल में आ सकते हैं, and they said कि कौन सी ट्रेनिंग में आप आए थे करने, they couldn't even remember the which training had they attended. वो टैबलेट्स, हमने पूछा टैबलेट्स आपके स्कूल में हैं, तो बोले हाँ कहीं रखे तो है अलमारी के अंदर, लेकिन कहाँ रखे हमें पता ही नहीं है. तो such is the state of affairs. I just wanted to highlight.
Hence it is important that when you trade, or for that matter do anything, You have to go into the depth of it. What is the purpose of what you're doing? And then that also needs to be monitored, whether that purpose has been served or not. And this is an intermediate purpose, not the final purpose of learning outcomes. It's an intermediate process, whether the right person was sent, where was it sent, where was the training held. If it is held at the district headquarters, it's more of a jamboree. I mean, at best, it could be at a block level where teachers could come. In any case, there also the number increases. The more detailing that you do, the more you go down to the field, the better it is. Because, it's not merely telling somebody what you are telling him. He has to internalize what you're telling. Then he will not say, "Acha, kab hui thi aapki training?" If he has internalized it, he'll remember. And then he will put to use the hardware also, he'll not put it in the almirah. So, at the district level, bhashan, until unless he himself practices, understand the utility. I keep using this word. The person must understand the value proposition. What is in it for him? Once that happens, likelihood is internalize it. And once he internalizes it, he will not forget it.
Wonderful, sir. Thank you so much for the discussion today. I hope that the first aspect that we discussed about tracking, data, reporting, at least people can talk about it at the right places. That should be the first objective that we would love to see happening. And the ultimate objective would be that RFPs start coming out which detail these expectations, right? And perhaps there's another aspect that maybe we can talk about it other time, but even outcome-based financing could also be an option that the government could look
It's
at
an in thing
in
now.
the future.
And now, of course, you have these bonds that are coming up, outcome-based, and I'm sure they will go a long way.
Wonderful. Great to speak with you as always, sir. Thank you so much. And we'll see you in the other episode. Thank you.
Thank you.